Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and what a pleasure to be in Brisbane. It's my first time here in Australia. You will think that I am a bit limited, and maybe I am, but you might know that SWA's recently appointed high-level chair is Kevin Rudd. So my feeling when I landed yesterday and I started talking with people at the airport was, oh, they all speak like Kevin Rudd. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It is a pleasure, and it's an honor to be addressing you today and to be able to take part with so many practitioners at such a solutions-oriented event. I feel very privileged to be able to bring news of the Sanitation and Water for All Global Partnership to this part of the world and be able to share with you some of the work we have been doing, which could hopefully be of interest for many of you in this room. I have been asked to speak broadly to you about the challenges of implementing the WASH-related targets of the SDGs by 2030, and also about the work of SWA, is doing nationally and globally to address these challenges. For those who are not really aware of what we do and what we are a global multi-stakeholder partnership that brings together almost 150 partners from different groups. We call them constituencies, from countries, from civil society, academia, bilateral and multilateral support agencies, including banks, foundations, UN agencies, as well as the private sector. So if anyone among you is interested in joining SWA, please come and meet with me and other SWA partners who are together here at this important conference. So we work together to catalyze political leadership and action, to improve accountability and ensure that scarce resources are used more effectively. I don't have to tell you the extent of the WASH problems globally, the unacceptable large number of people without access to adequate water, and even worse statistics for access to adequate sanitation or hygiene. What I want to talk about is how we can address this through understanding those statistics as representing individuals, often marginalized, vulnerable, excluded people, and find new solutions based on better understanding of the reasons for exclusion from service provision. I do not want to underplay the huge challenge that we have ahead of us, but I also want to make a confession. As a human rights lawyer, I am delighted by the ambition of the SDG agenda and obviously by the prominence of human rights principles embedded within the SDGs, particularly within our Goal 6 on water and sanitation. Finally, we have a mainstream international instrument in our hands that we can use to control, encourage, push, and ultimately demand governments to analyze their institutions and systems with a view to reaching universal access to water and sanitation and act accordingly. The efforts required to reach Goal 6 require a move towards gender equality and equality in general. And we have to learn how to leave our comfort zone and not only look at our Goal 6, but also at all other goals of the SDGs. Read them and analyze other goals is also part of the work that we have to do to meet Goal 6. We did an exercise at SWA to go through all goals and targets and in order to assess which ones were directly or indirectly related to water and sanitation. All of them are. It's a conclusion that we'd reached. There is a connection to water and sanitation and hygiene in every single of the additional 16 goals. It will not be possible to achieve universal education or a reduction in maternal and child mortality without access to water and sanitation and without gender equality. Cities will not be more livable and inclusive without access to water and sanitation, including with the proper collection, treatment and disposal of fecal and other wastes. And so when we talk about the SDGs and about water and sanitation, we aim to address all WASH-related targets under all the different SDGs. The SDGs apply not only Oh, you are there. As Julian Colley said, do not apply only to those countries where current access levels are very low, where a too large proportion of the population, for example, practices open defecation. It also applies to countries where almost, but it's only almost, 100% of the people enjoy access to a high standard of service provision, but for whom a number of marginalized individuals and groups, perhaps people living in detention, perhaps homeless people, perhaps people belonging to ethnic minorities, indigenous populations, do not have access to basic services. These governments are now with the SDGs, well, I would say they were already before under human rights law, but they are now under the SDGs also required to think and act differently. And that is why it is, I think, a very exciting time for, well, for me and for everyone. Everybody has work to do. Nobody can say we are heroes, as was the case during the MDG era, where people said, well, I reached 50%, so I'm done. Now, this is not the case any longer. And everyone will be required, every single state, to answer to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum, which is the global accountability platform for the SDGs. I'm going now to ask you to, well, if you want, close your eyes, if not, keep them open, but at least take a minute to think of those individuals who do not have adequate access to water and sanitation in your country, or in the country you work. And ask yourselves, what are the reasons for this lack of access? Who are these people? And I want you to think about what would need to change in the way that data is gathered, that decisions are made, in combating the structural discrimination or stigmatization that exists in your society, that has a direct impact on the way that services are delivered and who has access to them. So, please, please, let's take a minute for you to think, for all of us to think of this, of identifying a person. Well, I just thought 30 seconds are enough. Each of you will have thought of different people. And I ask you to hold those people in your mind throughout the whole of this conference. Those are the people for whom we are seeking solutions. There is not a single individual on this planet, whoever they are or wherever they live, who does not have a human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. And solutions must be available to all. If some of you saw no clear image of those without access in your country, this also might mean something. It doesn't mean that things are perfect in your country. It might just simply mean that during the MDG era, we were all more focused on the low-hanging fruits, in showing positive results, and in reducing those without access as quickly as possible by 50%. We were never asked to identify and target the most vulnerable and marginalized. Very often when I ask governments who these people are, I understand that an apparently simple question raises issues that have not been systematically dealt with or addressed by governments and others. This was surely the case, for example, when I asked this question in my own country, Portugal. Who are the 2% who are left out? And I remember a government official looking at me very surprised and saying, oh, I had never thought of that. So let me tell you about the person that I had in mind. It is a girl, a teenager. Nowadays, she's not a teenager any longer, but when I met her, she was a teenager, and I met her in Dhaka, Bangladesh, a few years back, and she lived in a slum in the city. Her name was Dolly. She was a fantastic girl. She did not have access to adequate sanitation or water services in the slum, and as a girl responsible for collecting water for her family, this lack of access had a significant impact on her life. It was tough for her to attend school, school, and too much of her time was spent collecting often dirty water or managing her need for sanitation. Because the slum was illegal, the toilets and latrines that the people from the slum had built were being periodically bulldozed when the slum was destroyed, because it was technically, legally speaking, an illegal slum. So what exactly is the task that we have ahead of us? What needs to be done to make sure that Dolly gains access to services and is able to participate fully in social, economic and cultural life in Dhaka? Our SWA partners believe that we must start with political will, with the agreement and understanding that achieving universal access will require new approaches. Ensuring access to water and sanitation in slums may demand that governments reform those rules that prevent services from being provided to illegal or informal settlements, and to provide all people with access to procedures that allow them to approach their local government to find solutions to a lack of access. We also need to end the practice of projects that alleviate the suffering of a few, collecting user numbers that satisfy the limited requirements of many funders, and move towards systemic improvements that tackle the root causes of poverty, the root causes of exclusion, to provide sustainable services for all. To this end, SWA partners are promoting 4 collaborative behaviors for countries receiving significant development assistance which work together to support the political commitments made at the global level in the shape of the SDGs. We will start working on adapting these behaviors to all countries. The political will is to ensure services for all, which is at the center of the SDGs and which requires all countries to address inequalities, including gender inequality. This is at the center of our first collaborative behavior, which is to enhance government leadership of sector planning processes. This behavior recognizes that states hold the primary obligation in ensuring that everyone, including marginalized people, have access to services, and must lead all other stakeholders towards this aim through partnership and dialogue. This government leadership is essential for demonstrating political will to achieve universal access. Without this, there can be no progress, no change from the business as usual, no improvement for people like Dolly. The second behavior, to strengthen and use country systems, demands that the process developed through the first behavior are systematized, moving beyond projects that reach, as I said, few communities, to systems that build the necessary institutions and processes that will address discriminatory practices. This strengthening of systems, particularly where they are transparent and well understood by the local population through partnership with other development actors, will lead to communities such as Dolly's being included and even prioritized in plans for wash service provision. The third behavior, to use one information and mutual accountability platform, will also support people like Dolly through improved and coherent data collection. SWA recognizes the plethora of organizations working within any country, and this collaborative behavior requires these to work together in a transparent and accountable manner, creating one platform for data collection and monitoring. SWA continues to work closely with our colleagues from JMP and GLAS, I already saw them this morning here, to this end. Mutual accountability refers to the requirement first and foremost that governments are held to account for their actions, but partners, particularly donors, must also be held accountable for the strategies that they bring with them. All too often, donors are looking for a quick fix, the delivery of hardware, rather than the longer processes that build institutions and systems that will ensure sustainable services. And finally, the fourth behavior is to build sustainable water and sanitation sector financing strategies. And this behavior aims to avoid duplication of efforts and streamline financing strategies to have the strongest impact, including exploring approaches to ensuring that people who have been excluded from access to services such as Dolly are prioritized. Before I continue, I would just like to note that Dolly also worked to help herself and other women and girls like her by working with other girls at a hygiene club in the slum, where they made sanitary pads and sold them in the slum. Thus equipped, girls could attend school and women could go to work. But obviously this community project, which was in part funded by UNICEF, can only hope to address a small part of Dolly's problems. And what is required, as I said, is a more consistent and systematic resolution of the problems of access to wash in slum areas, as provided through the obligation to leave no one behind under the SDGs and SWA's collaborative behavior. This is also the reason why the high-level political dialogue that we undertake within SWA with ministers responsible for the sector is such an important dimension of our work. Governments and other stakeholders have already started moving towards using these behaviors, firstly by creating their baseline of access, analyzing which communities have access and which do not. What are the patterns of exclusion? Are there particular population groups that are consistently excluded? Whether ethnic minorities, specific language group, those living in hard-to-reach areas, whether remote rural areas where the Maasai lives in Tanzania, or the slums of central Mumbai, or the poor in Kiribati and Tuvalu, which I had the pleasure to visit in 2012, or the asylum seekers in Greece, or the homeless in California, and what is required in terms of policy and planning to reach them. Is it a question of simply building desalination plants, digging more wells, building more toilets, or allocating more money? Or are there specific discriminatory practices, processes of political favoritism, or stigmatization of specific population group at work that first need to be addressed in order to achieve universal access? I contend that in the majority of cases, the problem does not stem only from lack of sufficient finances or technical solutions, but from a structural problem, from an acceptance of inequality. And I recall the 2006 UNDP development report, which stated very eloquently that lack of access to water is normally not a problem of scarcity, of the resource. It's normally a problem of power or lack thereof. Those who have power normally have access to water, sanitation, and other services. Those who lack power do not have access. So the SDGs demand governments to act with greater openness and transparency, be accountable for their actions at all levels. They also demand greater and more intense multi-stakeholder engagement, exchanges of good practices and challenges, mutual support and new approaches to doing things. This includes the requirement that people without access have a voice in solving their own problems, as Dolly did. And this can highlight issues that may be invisible to the people who take access to services for granted. It is therefore essential to make space for civil society organizations, particularly those that represent marginalized or excluded individuals or groups, in order to fully understand what the challenges are and to listen to any proposals coming from the ground to resolve this. For sanitation and hygiene in particular, the solutions might not require significant investments, but will focus more on how individuals behave, on social norms and taboos. To cite just one example, we have been seeing seismic changes in how menstrual hygiene is understood and acted on, through challenging taboos, through education of not only women and girls, but also men and boys on the biological processes and physical requirements of menstruating women and girls. This has led to social change and a demand for better access to better sanitation, particularly in schools and health centers. This is only possible where those who are excluded or discriminated against are able to make their voices heard. I hope that I have imparted to you my vision of what the SDGs should mean for our WASH sector, but it is up to all of us to make sure the SDGs are realized, keeping those excluded individuals and their daily struggles at the forefront of our minds. Many thanks for your attention. I wish you a very interesting and fruitful conference.